Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Carbon Markets Expansion session. I'm your moderator, Rob Lee, Program Director with the Climate Action Reserve, and I am truly so excited to be here with you all. There we go. We know we're in a race to limit warming, and to do so, we really have to maximize capital investment in the most impactful greenhouse gas mitigation opportunities available. And to that end, in this session, we're going to focus on how offsets enable capital investment to be directed to those opportunities and what we need to do to mobilize that investment. So I'll start out by saying it's a real treat to be with the panelists in this format rather than sitting in one of the various task forces and committees and work groups on this exact topic. We've heard from a number of perspectives already today on this issue. But here with me to chat about meeting this increased demand for offsets is really an illustrious panel of experts. And so I'll introduce the panelists going clockwise on my screen. Kim Carnahan is Director of Disruption Technologies at NG Impact, where she leads the firm's advisory work on carbon offsets and alternative fuels. Previous to joining NG Impact, Kim served as the United States Chief Negotiator for Climate Change. Over nearly a decade at the State Department, she managed the teams that negotiated the Paris Agreement and the International Civil Aviation Organization's Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Agreement for International Aviation, or CORSIA. Kim, thank you for being here, and would love to hear your perspective looking at these issues and what you're telling organizations that are really looking into this space through your advisory work at NG.
Thanks, Robin, and hello to everyone out there in the virtual world. I'm very happy to be here. At NG, I'm not sure if you're familiar with NG Impact, but we are the advisory firm of NG Group. And so we advise both internally to other NG business units as well as externally to NG customers on an array of energy solutions and decarbonization solutions. So in my particular group, we handle everything to do with net zero. So once companies have devise significant carbon reduction plans, they then come to us to kind of go the last mile. And that often includes carbon offsets, but it also includes making investments or plans to invest in advanced fuels like hydrogen and alternative aviation or even maritime fuels. It also includes kind of advanced scope 3 decarbonization plans as well. So we kind of cover a broad array of work within my part of NG Impact. And one of the questions we get most often is, what do I do if we can no longer reduce emissions internally, given, for example, the carbon price that my company has set, and how do we get the rest of the way to our goal? So that's what we help companies figure out. And right now, a lot of those companies are coming to us and saying, we'd like to invest in high quality offsets in particular sectors, in particular countries where our company already does a lot of business, and with particular benefits. And so what we do is often actually devise an RFP process where we help companies go out and find out what types of projects are out there that meet their very particular goals, including biodiversity and community benefit, supporting women, that kind of thing. So we're able to kind of really customize an offset strategy that meets their needs and certainly is high quality and ensures significant emission reductions.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Naomi Swickard. Naomi is the Chief Program Officer with Verra, where she oversees Verra's portfolio of standards, leading implementation and evolution of Verra programs, including those related to RED Plus and FOLU, and provides strategic input to organizational opportunities and challenges, among many, many other things. Naomi, so we've heard from policy thinkers and product developers over the course of this day on this topic, but would love to hear from you, bringing your standards perspective and as the Chief Program Officer for Verra, on what you're seeing and what you're working on in response to and really in anticipation of this growing interest in offsets.
Much. Can you hear me okay?
Great.
Sorry, having some challenges with my headphones. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to speak. For anyone that doesn't know who Verra is, we manage a number of standards looking to drive finance to sustainable outcomes, both in terms of climate change, but broader sustainability as well. Obviously, today, the most relevant is the Verified Carbon Standard. But we also work in high quality SDG accounting, looking at sustainable development impacts of climate projects, as well as those that are not necessarily attached to climate. And we're the largest standard in the voluntary markets, increasingly recognized in compliance markets as well, although those terms are becoming less clear as markets converge, and same units might be used in both, which is relevant to a lot of the conversation today. Yeah, in terms of your question there, we see a huge potential for scaling markets, but I think there's a need to provide more clarity to companies on what is expected, both in terms of how they're looking at their own footprint and really the long-term commitment towards decarbonization, and ultimately what role offsets should play in that. And a real need for working on providing buyers more clarity in terms of the quality of units, the types of claims that can be made based on what they're buying, and looking forward to digging into all of that with the panel today.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, we have Scobie McKay. Scobie is Managing Director within the Commodities and Global Markets business at Macquarie, based in Houston. Scobie is leading the voluntary carbon efforts for that business group for the Americas. He joined Macquarie in 2015 in Singapore in the Commodities Markets and Finance team, looking at structured physical commodity and commodity-linked financing transactions, before moving to lead the Supply Chain Solutions team in Houston in early 2017. Scobie is an admitted solicitor in both England and Wales and Australia, and holds Master of Laws degrees from the Australian National University, and is currently an MBA candidate at the University of Oxford. Scobie, would love to hear your perspective on what you're seeing in the carbon markets these days.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thanks everyone for having us here. Macquarie is an Australian headquartered global financial institution. We have a pretty broad array of efforts focused on the energy transition and climate transition more generally. Our funds management business is the largest infrastructure owner in the world, and we manage about half a $500 billion of assets, Aussie dollars of assets under that business. That business has just made a net zero commitment 2040, and that's a sort of indicator of our overall commitment and involvement in this space for our own business. We are currently the #1 renewables advisor in the world. Across our funds and principal investment business, we have about 46 gigawatt of renewable energy assets, either under operation or development. And we are pretty deeply involved in a whole range of other decarbonisation efforts along the time scale and the spectrum. In terms of our involvement in carbon markets, we've been active in global carbon markets for at least 15 years. We're quite big liquidity providers to the European market. We're active in the North American carbon markets. We're active in Australia, New Zealand, and building out our desks that cover Asia and China. In terms of offsets, we've been in this space for quite some time. We are really focused on end-to-end transaction delivery, and what I mean by that is we're investing capital in projects on the ground in emerging markets and in developed markets, and then using our position in terms of both access to projects and our knowledge and presence in the financial markets to help to design financial products and services for our clients. And so we recently executed the world's first carbon neutral crude cargo transaction as an example of bundling of offsets with other commodities. We've invested in commodities exchanges to help us to broaden our platform and access to market for clients for carbon-related products, and we're helping to design things like derivatives contracts that will, we hope, spur the market.
Great, thank you. So maybe we'll start with a bit of a higher level question. You know, one of the comments during one of the plenary sessions this morning was that there's a bit of criticism being levied at the use of offsets, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with some of the criticisms against forest carbon credits that have come out lately. So maybe before we get into questions around scaling, let's start with the purpose of offsetting. We're seeing more and more companies and governments making really ambitious commitments to cut their greenhouse gases, and I think we're seeing some advocacy for a hierarchy of measuring and reporting, and then investing in direct reductions. And Kim, you touched on this earlier, and then offsetting the rest beyond what they could mitigate internally. So maybe Kim, you could talk to what you think the role of offsetting and carbon finance and carbon markets in general have in the road to a carbon-free economy.
Yeah, happy to. And to kind of start with that issue you raised, the idea of a mitigation hierarchy. At NG Group, we do ascribe to the mitigation hierarchy, and we at NG Impact, I explain it to my clients whenever whenever we're asked, how they should approach setting their carbon reduction goals. And for those not familiar with NG, we're actually the largest independent power producer in the world, and one of the first energy companies to have a science-based target. And the Science-Based Targets Initiative basically requires that you reduce internal emissions, by a certain percentage every year. And so NG has been working very hard at that. We've actually more than halved our emissions in the last 5 years, and it gets harder and harder over time to continue to make those internal reductions. And so companies come to me now. Maybe they want to put in place a science-based target and have us help them plan to meet it. Or maybe they just want some advice on, what kinds of targets are out there and how offsetting fits in. So what we do is we share with them the options, and we explain to them the trade-offs. We show them, these are solutions that are available to reduce your emissions internally. This is the business case for implementing those solutions. And also, here's the business case for implementing those solutions in 5 years instead of today, or in 10 years instead of today. And those trade-offs are what help any particular company figure out when and how to integrate offsetting into their emission reduction strategy. And that's kind of how I think of offsetting, is a tool for flexibility. So you can focus on internal reductions, you can focus on, following that mitigation hierarchy, but you also don't have to make decisions that, leave stranded assets sooner than they need to be left. That they provide you, offsets provide you an opportunity to contribute to climate change, equally now as in the future, but perhaps now it's through offsets, and then in the future you make that big investment to switch over all of the boilers in your facility or something like that. So it's that flexibility that offsets provide, and that's kind of what we share with clients.
Great, fantastic. And Scobie, I don't know if you wanted to add your perspective on that.
Yeah, I do. I think, thank you. I think, there is a lot of debate around within the offset community, and I would say outside of the offset community, so within corporates that aren't very close to that market, around sort of integrity questions and so on. I think organizations like Verra, for example, have done an excellent job over the last decade of really addressing integrity at the forefront of what they're doing. Personally, and I don't, this is maybe a little bit of a controversial view, I actually think that those integrity issues and concerns are really overstated. And I think that we need to all just take a deep breath and take a step back. We're in the middle of a climate crisis. And this is not an either or scenario. It's every hand on deck. We have to do everything available to make sure that we're going to get to a sensible climate outcome. And so when we talk about a mitigation hierarchy, the problem that we see with the way a lot of corporates are thinking about this is they think, I'll spend the next decade reducing what I can, and then I'll think about offsetting as an afterthought. And frankly, that's upside down. The way we think and we are approaching this is offsets are probably the cheapest and most effective way to do something right now to have a climate impact and to reduce your net carbon footprint. That should be something that you roll out while you labor for, and deploy capital on things that are inherently longer term, more capital intensive, and will not have results. So a lot of the structural decarbonisation efforts that are being worked on around the world are inherently, multi-year project-based changes. They are technology heavy in some cases with technology, but relying on technology that hasn't been proven at scale or even doesn't really exist yet at the scales required. And these things are going to take time and a huge amount of capital to roll out. And I think in the interim, we should all be thinking right now about what we can do. And offsets are a great way to do that. What the problem is it's an atmospheric problem. It's a net CO2 or GHG balance in the atmosphere. So we need to be out doing what we can now to take that net balance down. And, I think a lot of people, frankly, don't understand the offset market very well. They read offset and they think greenwashing. And it just doesn't do justice to the degree of the robustness of the frameworks that Verra and others have put in place around the market. I think one of the other things to remember is offsets are also a really important tool for a just transition. Like when we think about the preponderance of offset projects around the world are in developing markets, and they are projects that funnel money and prosperity, hopefully over time, to people in some of the least privileged people around the world. And, when we start to hear this, we're starting to get hierarchies within or different qualitative perspectives on, a CCUS avoided ton or sequestered ton is more valuable than a ton from an avoided deforestation project. I think it misses the point, and it becomes actually a very divisive north-south dialogue, because it's going to be the global north that can afford multi-billion-dollar CCUS projects, but the people in the global south haven't caused the preponderance of the GHG emissions that are causing the problem we have, and they're bearing a lot of the brunt of it. And offsets are a mechanism to redirect some of the wealth towards those people. So I think that's a really important aspect of this journey that we need to remember. And I suppose our interest at the moment around this narrative is to really encourage people to think a little bit more aggressively about what they're doing. Now's the time to do something, and offsets are a tool to do something now.
Great, thanks, Kobe. And I'd like to just latch on to something that you just commented there. And I think it sounded somewhat like you were saying that, to an extent, a ton is a ton is a ton, and we need to maybe look at fungibility of carbon credits. And maybe we can dig into that concept, and we've heard a little bit about from some other perspectives on this idea earlier today as well. Does the market need fungibility of carbon credits to scale? And if so, what are some steps that market participants and organizations and programs should take to address that issue? Are there any solutions or programs that you'd like to see to get more support or get further developed? And maybe Naomi, you can go to you on this one.
Sure. I mean, I'll start by saying that I do think fungibility has usefulness and is incredibly important in terms of that last bit that Scobie said, or you, Rob, that a ton is a ton. That part is really important. I think that the challenge a little bit in terms of that otherwise focusing on equivalency and standardized prices and contracts is that there is a distinction in units based on buyer preference, particularly in voluntary markets. When we're talking about compliance markets or in ETS, generally people are looking for the cheapest ton. They're trying to meet an obligation. It's a very different thing at the moment in the voluntary markets when there's corporate commitments that, as Kim was mentioning earlier, there's an interest in a certain type of unit. Some companies have a big impact on forest and land use, and so therefore really want to preference those activities. Or they want to contribute to multiple goals, and the sustainable development benefits of those land-based activities are particularly attractive. So there just are distinctions that can be made that I think make it harder to get to, for example, standardized pricing in particular. That said, I think there's a lot of elements that we can and should be working on that will help this issue in terms of fungibility and transparency. A number of those are currently being discussed in the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Markets. So one of those ideas is, for example, some sort of governance body or assessment body that would look at different voluntary market approaches and try to provide some assessment of integrity and that they're meeting minimum standards of quality. And we really welcome something like that. I think that, for us at Verra, and I know at CAR as well and Gold Standard, we have all worked very hard over the last decade and more to ensure that there is integrity and transparency in units and we're meeting all of these core carbon principles. And so I think having an independent body that can look at that and assess it and communicate it in particular is really welcome. It needs to be designed right. And so we're working along with many others to contribute to that. Some other areas that I think are valuable, there's this concept of a meta registry that has also come up both under the World Bank and market. I think that's going to be valuable to have a single place where all of the units can be tracked and a single place to look at the transparency of market transactions. I think the other area that needs clarity, as I started with at the beginning, is really, how should corporates address this hierarchy? And what claims ultimately can they talk about at the end of it? And while there will be lots of different corporate approaches, I think the key part is that commitment to a long-term goal of decarbonization while using offsets now, as Scobie was saying, and having clarity around that and guidance and around the kinds of claims that can and should be made, I think is really helpful to the sector overall. But at the end of the day, particularly when we're talking about these activities in voluntary markets, I do think there will continue to be some distinguishing between units because of those preferences and sort of the other impacts that corporates are ultimately trying to drive.
Yeah, and I think, Ken, you had mentioned that the clients that you're advising want particular offsets in particular sectors and particular locations with particular benefits. And I think with each additional layer of funneling, the supply that meets those criteria shrinks. And so I don't know if you had any perspective on pricing with regards to that kind of shrinking funnel and layering, or maybe Scobie, if you wanted to jump in on that as well.
I'll just very quickly, I'll say that we're not seeing major price implications from that just yet, but I'm seeing a future where it's going to come into effect. For example, I'm working with one company that's very focused on water. Their business has a lot to do with water, and they're interested in kind of working in the pioneering world of blue carbon offsets in particular countries. And there just aren't very many projects of the kind that they're looking for. And so not only are we having to get in early and make commitments to purchase, over a long period of time, we're also we're also looking into working with project developers that are just at the beginning stages of their project development. So, when companies that we're working with have these more niche needs, then we're advising them to get in and get their hands dirty as soon as possible so that they can make sure they have access to the units that they want.
Just to that, I suppose, depends a little bit on what we're talking about when we talk about fungibility. I mean, there's one thing to talk about fungibility between different types of offsets within the voluntary market. Maybe I misunderstood your question, but what's probably the more critical question from my perspective is, as these markets evolve, what is the fungibility, if anything, between voluntary and regulatory markets? And as we start to get things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism considered in Europe and in Canada, for example, let's take a live example. So there's increasing trend towards carbon neutral LNG cargoes globally. If I'm a LNG producer and I import a carbon neutral LNG cargo into Europe, that cargo has been rendered carbon neutral by virtue of bundling with high quality Vera carbon offsets from a variety of different projects. Does that offsetting count for the purposes of the CBAM or not? And those sorts of intersections of the voluntary and regulatory market are going to be critical in terms of shaping demand and demand shape in terms of both geographical coverage, but also potentially project type, depending on how regulators look at different types of projects. I actually think it's incumbent on us in the market to really be quite militant in pushing regulators to make sure that the types of carbon regulatory mechanisms that are put in place are not protectionist in the sense of excluding the use of offsets from emerging markets, because at the end of the day, that becomes a form of protectionism. Just like any other trade protection mechanism, and so I think we should all be alive to that idea as we get this proliferation of domestic regulatory or regional regulatory markets, the greater the degree of interaction and fungibility between those markets and the international voluntary market, the more dynamic a global market we're going to have, which I think has two implications. One is it probably serves customers and buyers of credits better because they have more and greater access to market and different and diversity of supply. But it also works more to ensure that funds are getting funneled to projects in developing markets and not just getting concentrated in developed markets, which is quite possibly the case if, depending on how tightly wound those regulatory frameworks are.
Yeah, that's a great point, and something that a speaker earlier this morning also touched on. They made the point that, or argued that the entire voluntary carbon market exists solely because of kind of a lack or a vacuum of regulatory policy, and that the voluntary markets really just serve as a bridge until that regulatory framework develops. So maybe we could kind of continue discussing that concept. As interest in carbon markets grows, the dynamic between the voluntary and regulatory markets and their interaction is very confusing. And to what extent do you all think that voluntary markets either compete with or can complement or support regulatory programs? Is there a way, as Scobie was just describing, for regulatory and voluntary markets to coexist and really drive further ambition and impact on the climate? And maybe we can go to you, Naomi.
Sure. Yeah. So I think there's a huge amount of potential here. And in fact, we're already seeing a real blurring of the lines. The VCS is not only a standard for voluntary markets. We would refer to ourselves at this point as an independent standard and not a voluntary standard. And it's been recognized in a number of domestic compliance markets. It's been recognized by CORSIA. There's potential for using the VCS as a basis for Article 6.2 trades. So I think we're already seeing that. At the end of the day, a ton should be a ton. And so the structures that are needed to underpin that ton and to ensure that it has integrity and transparency are the same. Now, we do need to be careful because certain markets do have specific requirements. And so the way that we're approaching it is to provide labels that allow us to identify units that meet market requirements. So to give a couple of examples, CORSIA has a specific set of requirements that go beyond sort of basic carbon quality principles and includes things like the start date and specific activities. And so with that, CORSIA also has requirements around double counting that mirror the Paris Agreement and the need for corresponding adjustments. So in order for a unit to be used in CORSIA, we will be putting labels on those that qualify. So those that meet all of the CORSIA criteria, that have a letter of authorization from the country that a corresponding adjustment will be given. The registry system then allows you to very clearly identify what units those are. There's a label on the unit. So we can have all of the same structures that sit behind the generation of a credit, and by adding a label, identify which ones can be used in what markets or for what purposes. So I think that's going to be really key to making sure that we can leverage these units across the different markets that are emerging while providing clarity over how they can be used.
Great, thanks. And Kim, did you want to add anything on that?
Me too. I mean, I totally agree with what she just said. And this is the interaction between voluntary and compliance markets is one of those emerging issues that clients are increasingly coming to us to help them think through. And as she mentioned, we are seeing this interaction in a really big way in CORSIA. We're seeing it the voluntary and independent standards, as Naomi mentioned. They're doing their best to adjust to the needs that are developing in terms of tagging offsets or units as having particular characteristics, and that's fantastic. But I also think we need the governments to step up in certain ways that they haven't so far. We're seeing also the use of, or the kind of provision for use of so-called voluntary offsets in domestic compliance regulations, some economy-wide and some more kind of pilot scale programs right now. And what's happening in these situations is that governments are requiring covered entities, private sector entities, to buy and cancel, or buy and then transfer to a government to cancel units that come with a corresponding adjustment. We're definitely seeing it in CoreSave, but we're also seeing it in specific domestic contexts. And that's very hard. It's no small task under ICAO or under Paris, or under the Paris Agreement, to tell a private sector entity that they have to go out there and get a government, or that the standard, like Vera, has to get a government to make a corresponding adjustment, to agree that it is going to adjust its emissions tracking under the Paris Agreement to account for the sale of that unit. That's something that is really kind of gets to the heart of sovereign work, government work. And so we need governments to kind of step up and not just adopt the Article 6 rules under the Paris Agreement, but also to help facilitate private sector entities to acquire these kinds of units going forward. And that's something that we're really not seeing a movement towards yet. We're seeing governments try to put that on the private sector. And as I think you mentioned at the beginning, Rob, I used to be one of those government representatives. I used to run the climate change team at the State Department. And, in that role, I would have seen this as being unacceptable, that we would put that on the private sector. Governments need to solve that problem.
Thanks, Kobe.
Yeah, if I can just add a little bit. I think that, the question is an interesting one. Is there room for both? I mean, my view is certainly in the immediate term there is. The way we sort of think about it when we talk to clients about working with them to supply carbon offsets or other solutions is as a stack. So you have a regulatory obligation which covers part of your emissions footprint, and then you have a voluntary part of the stack, which is for ambition over and above what you're required to do by law, but what your shareholders or your constituents or whatever else expect of you, or what you as a governing body of your organization may be aspiring to. And so I think, as you articulated, Rob, it's an ambition magnifier. It's taking people over and above what they're obliged to do by law. I think that space is going to regulatory environments are ratcheting up in terms of their required level of ambition that they're requiring for corporates acting in their jurisdiction. But I think there will remain this, part of the stack that is for ambition over and above what's required by law. And I think that's where the voluntary market or independent market will continue to play a part. And then you have the other interesting, the fungibility and as Naomi said, this idea that parts of the voluntary market or some units of the voluntary market can then be used increasingly to satisfy regulatory requirements, and over time that will proliferation of those sorts of rules will continue. So I think there's going to be quite a long road where both of those coexist, and indeed they may coexist permanently, depending on how ambitious we all choose to be in decarbonisation.
Great, that's fascinating. And so far we've spoken at a pretty high level about the carbon markets and offsets, and maybe we can spend a little time drilling down into what you're all seeing on the ground, and in response to this anticipated growth in offsets and carbon markets. What new developments are you seeing? Innovative programs like low carbon or renewable fuels, or technologies like remote sensing, or new sectors that haven't really been able to participate in offset and carbon finance previously, like agriculture or something like that. What of these are really most exciting to you and have the most potential to really drive some of the ambition and scale that we're talking about? Maybe I can turn that over to you, Naomi.
Yeah, thank you. I think there is a lot of progress in terms of new sectors that can contribute to the solution. Some of those that we see, there's a lot of attention on removals at the moment, as well as on new areas in broader nature-based solutions like blue carbon. So looking at wetlands and coastal ecosystems and whatnot. I think the other interesting area of growth is around just how do we do things more efficiently, leveraging new technology. So many of these activities already use remote sensing, but the realm of the possible in terms of doing that on more live basis, using it to streamline some of the verification, et cetera. Like there's a lot of potential there that I think is untapped and is interesting for us to work on. We have several working groups moving forward that are looking to do that in each of those spaces. But I would just say, I think we have to be careful about some of the, quote, exciting new innovations. Some of the others are going to be things like carbon capture and storage technologies, which, just to reiterate what Scobie said earlier, we have to be careful about what the most, how investment is driven to those activities versus where it's most needed, both in terms of equity and making sure that finance flows to the developing world, but also in terms of what's most important to the climate solution. Removals, whether those are ecosystem-based or technological-based, are important. But if we don't protect standing forests today, then we're going to lose a lot of what is absolutely critical to us as a species, not just on the climate front. And I don't think we're ever going to dig out of that hole if we lose them. So not to mention the losses of biodiversity and everything else that go along with that, and community impacts, et cetera. So, in our view, it's really, really important to make sure that we're driving the finance where it's needed, most critically from a perspective of global ecosystems and climate change and people, at the same time as pushing the envelope in terms of new technologies that can be a part of the solution.
Great. Now, I would love to hear your perspective on this, Scobie, as an active investor in this space.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I look on the CCUS point. I really agree with Naomi. I think it's all hands on deck again. It's everything we can do, but I think creating a divisive dialogue around one is better than the other, it just kind of misses the point. And I do think that again, I think it's we risk sort of dying of our own hubris if we think that we can engineer our way ourselves out of a problem that we've engineered ourselves into. We've got to sort of have a little bit more respect than that and step back and say, well, these standing forests, for example, they have inherent value, and we've got to give those value, and the carbon markets is one way to give those value. And so I think actually, what's the most exciting innovation or development in the market at the moment? It's the conversation that's happening, because markets don't exist without buyers. And I think frankly, I think the innovation that we all really need to land on is what we've kind of been talking about throughout this whole panel, which is legitimacy. We need to really just close the book on the legitimacy discussion and get on with doing stuff. Talking is not going to solve the climate problem. And so we can talk ourselves to death, or we can get on and do projects and get deals done and create a vibrant market where we're actually funneling money into projects on the ground. Maybe not all of them are going to be 110%, infallible, but point to another sector of the economy which has those sort of track records. I mean, I think, it's this we're really risking this sector, particularly paradoxically, this sort of perfect as the enemy of the good situation. And it's just, we got to get over that dialogue. It's completely unhelpful. I think the best innovation we could possibly land on is just agreeing that the carbon markets have a really important place to play in decarbonisation, along with all the other array of initiatives that we all need to collectively embark on to have actual absolute reduction impact. And so I think, we can talk about trading platforms, we can talk about meta registries, all of which are great, remote sensing great, but really what's going to unlock pace and value and impact in this is just getting over this legitimacy conversation and getting on with it. And I think we can somehow work out a focus on that. I think we're going to do something good.
Yeah, well said. I see a lot of nodding heads. So maybe at this point, I can turn to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. Got a few good questions here. Maybe let's start this first one. This one's for Naomi. In Colombia, VCUs can be used for compliance purposes. How did Colombia come to that decision, and are VCUs only allowed voluntary credits? And how did that impact VERA's work in Colombia?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think the market in Colombia is a real example. South Africa has a similar model, and I think they're really leading thinking in terms of what is possible with developing country economies and middle-income country economies. And I wasn't in the room when Colombia made that decision, so I can't really speak to everything that went into it. But I think one of the main reasons is that the VCS, along with other recognized standards, and I believe it accepts gold standard and possibly CDM as well. I can't recall on the latter. Is to be able to implement something quickly and efficiently and using something that has international credibility. One of the benefits of leveraging existing standards is that you don't have to create your own. And there, of course, can be benefit to that, but I think it's often underestimated how much effort goes into creating a credible standard and being able to meet those core carbon principles and do so transparently and with good governance and everything else. So leveraging existing standards is a great way to be able to leapfrog into driving a domestic market more quickly than if you were to develop everything ground up from scratch. And in terms of impact on us, and we're very happy to support this kind of a market. I think it's also been really interesting in terms of creating domestic demand for units that I think allows for more resiliency for projects on the ground by having some options in terms of markets. And that I think has been really helpful to more certainty amongst activities there. And we're starting to see growth in project development because of it. So a great example that I think can be replicated in many other countries.
That's great. The next question's for Scobie. It's a questions actually. Could you explain how you are helping corporates reduce emissions via offsets? Do you trade offsets? And then as a follow-up, are you using the geo futures in any way?
Yeah, I suppose so. We're working with corporates in a number of ways. One is to help them to measure and then offset their emissions, whether it's Scope 1, Scope 2, and or Scope 3, through supplying offsets. And so the transaction that we did with Occidental earlier this year is an example. What we've done there is we're trying to catalyze a market for carbon neutral commodities. So that in that case, we measured the end-to-end life cycle carbon footprint of the crude oil from production all the way through to combustion of the end refined products, and then bundled that with sufficient number of VCUs to render the cargo carbon neutral. So we're designing structured products like that. We are supplying offsets directly, and then we are helping. We did invest in expansive CBL markets about a year or so ago, which is the only really active carbon offset exchange in the world, and we're helping them to do product design in terms of contracts, etc., on that platform that we think will help the market in terms of liquidity, being able to give value to different types of offsets. To think, comments that Kim and Naomi made earlier around different clients wanting different types of projects and products. So we are supplying and trading offsets, and then I suppose what we're also doing is putting our balance sheet to work in projects. So the most recent one, which was publicly announced, is a project to give out 1 million clean cook stoves to households in sub-Saharan Africa, or I should say to 1 million households in sub-Saharan Africa, in 3 least developed countries, in order to generate offsets, which we'll then use to supply into our clients that are looking to offset their emissions. And we are doing that both for our own book, but also working with clients who want to have a curated set of projects that are stood up. We have balance sheet to put to work. We have expertise to put to work, and an appetite to go and invest in those projects. So we're doing that as a service, essentially, to our client base.
And I'd love to just follow up on something. Earlier, one of the speakers had commented on, a disconnect between the timing of supply and demand of offset credits. I think due to the prevalence of spot purchases in the market. And so I was wondering, Scobie, if you've seen anything around like innovations in, I think you mentioned some contracting and creative like financial structures that can help scale the carbon markets.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the simplest, most sort of rudimentary iteration of that, which we're offering already to clients is warehousing. So basically being able to say, look, there isn't a liquid forward market. The geo contract has recently launched, but is still relatively liquid. And we hope that liquidity will grow on that and the tenors available will grow. But until that time, institutions like ourselves are comfortable holding physical offsets. And so we can offer to warehouse spot volumes and to bridge that into forwards. I think that you will start to see, as we get past that legitimacy conversation and get into a more liquid and more dynamic market, you'll start to see the proliferation of more and more financial instruments around forward contracted volumes. Options have been used for quite a long time in this market. And I think you'll continue to see options being, quite a widely used tool. But there's work going on. For example, ISDA is considering whether they'll do a specific annex for this market. I think you will see quite a lot of development in this space over the coming years. But there is certainly warehousing and other similar products that we're currently offering that I think can help with some of those issues.
And then maybe a question for anyone who wants to jump in. This is from Eric Wilburn. What do you see as the biggest limiting factor in increasing supply of projects to the markets over the next 5 years?
I'm happy to have a go at that. Naomi, would you like to?
Go ahead, I'll follow up.
Frankly, I think it's going to be, a shortage of people on the ground who know what they're doing. I don't think it's going to be a shortage of capital. There's quite a lot of capital now looking for homes in these projects, but it's not informed capital. It's not capital that has the ability to go and stand projects up in its own right. And so I think, people on the ground who know what they're doing is going to be a real bottleneck. I think the other thing is regulatory uncertainty. So buyers not wanting to necessarily sign up. I mean, these projects need offtake contracts to make them viable. And so buyers not wanting to necessarily sign up for a 10-year or 15-year or 20-year contract if they don't know how voluntary units are going to be treated in increasingly expansive regulatory markets or regulatory frameworks. I think that's one. I think, lastly, I would say, and probably most importantly, it is just the same thing again. You can't have a market without buyers. And so, there is a finite amount of merchant projects, meaning uncontracted projects that people will do. I think in this market, there is appetite for people to go and stand up projects that are not contracted. But at some point, that becomes toppish and you need contracted offtake to give, cash flow certainty for projects. And I think, again, until we have a sort of critical mass of buyers going into the market to commit to offtake, that will be the economic inhibitor to getting a good quality scale in projects.
Yeah, I would just add to that or emphasize the regulatory uncertainty piece. I think that one is one that needs a lot of additional work, and everything from clarity on rules internationally down to within each country, and where governments are looking to reduce their own emissions versus allowing for the private sector to invest and deliver units that are internationally exportable. And that I think there's a lot of work to be done. We're working with a number of other groups on something called a global dialogue, climate focus, south north, and several other groups. Apologies for not the whole list there. Really looking at working with a range of actors in this space and with countries around the world to what do the countries need in terms of guidance and certainty, and stacking this up to make markets most successful, making sure that they can leverage that finance for where it's most needed, within the country, help make sure it's directed towards areas that are the hardest to abate or the most expensive to abate, and set appropriate policy, for example. And so all of that regulatory uncertainty in terms of domestic policy and incentives is also something that I think is needs a lot more work to provide clarity and ensure that these projects have clarity over their long-term lifespan within each individual country.
Great, and then maybe kind of following up on the regulatory uncertainty question, Naomi, there's a question here that might be a bit of a Pandora's box, but there's a question on Vera's decision to not require corresponding adjustments for voluntary credit transactions under the updated VCS program, and really kind of leaving it as a choice. Would love to hear from you on that decision and maybe what went into that.
Sure. I mean, so there's some really clear places where corresponding adjustment is needed, assuming that's what gets agreed under Article 6. You need it under Article 6. You need it when you're trading between two countries. You also need it in a situation like Corsia, which is essentially acting almost like a country, and it's reporting. So to be very clear, those are going to be essential in certain cases. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be using labels to identify those units. Voluntary markets are quite different than that, because you don't have a unit moving from one country to another. You don't have it moving from one NDC to another. Instead, you have only one country reporting it in their NDC, the host country. Beyond that, there's a number of cases that are really clear that you don't need a corresponding adjustment. So there are a number of companies out there that are starting to say things like they're making a contribution to a country's NDC rather than using it as an offset. So that's a clear case where you really don't need a corresponding adjustment. We don't believe that you need it in the voluntary space because of that bit about the accounting. It needs to accrue to one country and be reported by one country, and that's a different thing than in compliance markets. The other issue really is about making sure that this equity and finance flows to where it's most needed, and that finance can feasibly flow to developing countries to help them achieve their NDCs, and that we can make sure that that doesn't undermine accounting or ambition by making sure that helps them achieve their NDC and then go further. So in our view, there are different ways to address that problem. Without spending another 15 minutes sort of going into the detail of all of the debates had in this space, please feel free to read all of our posts on this, and happy to answer questions individually, because this could be a thesis on its own. But that's essentially most of the logic behind it. But as I mentioned, we are continuing to work on this question, and I think there are a number of other issues that do need to be further elaborated in terms of the claims that can be made on the back of it, and in terms of ultimately, how do we support countries to structure those markets in a way that really deliver what's needed and help to deliver that scaled ambition on the ground? And that's why we're continuing to work on this problem with many other actors, and in particular with countries around the world, because I think their voices have often not been a part of this dialogue yet. And it's one that we think is incredibly important, in particular to make sure that that finance can effectively flow where it's most needed.
Great. If no one wants to add anything else on that, I'll maybe move to the next question. So, as demand's growing for, voluntary carbon offsets, and we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges facing growing supply, you'd expect that there will be kind of an upward price pressure on the voluntary price of an offset. And I'm just wondering, looking forward, would love to hear how you all are thinking about, these voluntary commitments as they face this upward price pressure, how that might interact with really specifically a voluntary commitment, and if that might kind of suppress further demand, or change the calculus for how this demand is driven.
I'll go quickly on that. I don't want to take all that my time, but yeah, look, I think the short answer to that is that's exactly why corporates should be thinking about doing stuff now, because you can go and sign up to what's essentially a flat price or slightly ratcheting price offtake out of a project, help to stand the project up. You don't necessarily need to be the capital provider to the project, and lock in a carbon supply that will do two great things. One is, lock in your carbon price so that you can meet your forward-looking voluntary commitments with certainty around the price that it'll cost you. And secondly, by signing that offtake commitment, you've helped to stand up a project that wasn't there before. So I think if people think about it like that, or even existing projects that have ongoing running costs, there's plenty out there that rely on offtake every year to continue to be in existence and continue to do the work that they're doing. So I think that the answer to that is there is absolutely going to be upward price pressure. I mean, I don't think there's an analyst in the world that would say that the price of carbon is going down over the medium to long term. Is there risk there, price risk there? Absolutely there is. And I would say that risk is going to fall onto late movers in the market who find themselves needing to buy offsets either for late announced voluntary commitments or for regulatory commitments that can be satisfied through voluntary units. And so I think it just militates for action now, not later. I mean, this is the time this is the part of the decade to take action, not at the end of the decade.
I would agree with that, and I would just add that one of the things we're having companies come to us to learn about is can we kind of link up with a project developer now to make early stage investments, but then also can we develop a plan to work with them in particular circumstances to do what's now often called insetting. So if they are working in a particular sector and they want to do emission reduction projects specifically within their value chain, then developing a relationship with a project developer in the country and in the sector that they want to work in is a good kind of way into the insetting world as well. And that's something that I'm seeing an increasing number of companies being interested in doing.
I might just add a final thought, which is that, ultimately what we need to get to is the decarbonizing activities that companies need to do within their own footprint and their own value chain. So as the carbon price goes up, they're going to be more and more incentivized to do some of those that are more expensive because it'll start to even out in price or become, lower cost to implement directly in their footprint rather than necessarily offset. So, as has been said several times throughout this, offsets are a bridge. They're a what we can do immediately right now, and they're absolutely critical to helping us keep the planet from its tipping points. But in the long run, the price of carbon rising is going to continue to incentivize more of that direct action by companies, which is a good thing. In the long run, that's really what we need to get to.
Great. And we're running out of time here. So maybe I'll leave it with this final question from Holly Kicklighter. Could there be more development of a co-benefits only credit into the carbon offset structure? For example, those that increase climate resiliency for biodiversity and receive a new kind of credit. And maybe we'll go to you, Naomi, for that.
Yeah, so we have a newish program called the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, or SD-VISTA. And that's exactly what it does. So it creates a way to quantify the sustainable development benefits that go beyond carbon and provide a way to verify and either make claims or even have an asset for those outcomes. So we're just seeing the first issuances of that. I think we have something like 14 million labeled VCUs now using SD-VISTA, which is exciting. And I think it's going to become more and more important in this space that the sustainable development benefits are better quantified, more accurately reported, and SD-VISTA really takes it to the next level in terms of providing a really high quality way to do that.
I don't know if Kim or Sylvia, if you had any thoughts on that before we wrap up.
Naomi's answer was really good. I think the idea that there would be a separate market for, the way we see, SD-VISTA or other things is really as a price differentiator in the market. So a ton is a ton. Maybe everyone doesn't agree on that, but a ton is a ton. And then you have the quantified, verified, sustainable development goal co-benefits, which act as a differential driver to the price on the carbon. We see that definitely informing the market more and more going forward, and I think it's already very prevalent. As Kim would know well, and buyers are willing to pay a premium for high quality projects that are aligned with their corporate vision or what's important to them as buyers. can there be an independent market for, just for sustainable development goal credits that's sort of separable from the carbon benefit itself, which I think maybe the question was getting at. Perhaps down the line, but my view is that's probably not that helpful at the moment, because we don't need more fragmentation of the market. We need a consolidation of the market and more buyers in there. And so my view would be that maybe there is a space for that, but I'm not sure that it would be productive at the moment, rather than just using them as a price differentiator for carbon units.
Great. Well, that brings us to time. So I wanted to thank you, Naomi, Kim, and Scobie for a really wonderful panel. Really appreciate your time. And for those of you tuning in, I really hope you found that as interesting and informative as I did, and hope that you all enjoy the rest of NACW. Thank you.